Scout bands like this one, the 6th Silesian Scouts and Girl Guides Troop, I don't think I'm going to...
This is NewsHour, coming to you live from London with James Coomarasamy. The former Vatican treasurer, Cardinal George Pell, whose conviction for child abuse was overturned earlier this year, has told the BBC that his conservative views had driven public opinion against him.
I think there's no doubt whatsoever that my social conservatism is irritating to a lot of people. But for my basic Christian positions, I make no apology at all. One of the strengths of our way of life is trial by jury, and public opinion was very hostile to the Catholic Church, both because of the extent of the pedophilia, the way it was sometimes dealt with. But whatever about that, the atmosphere was hostile. I was certainly one of the figures that were identified with this old bad church.
Well, the 79-year-old was the highest-ranking church figure to be convicted, but the High Court of Australia quashed that conviction back in April after the Cardinal's lawyers had argued that other evidence had not been properly considered during his trial. Well, joining us now is Christopher Lamb, Rome correspondent for the Catholic weekly The Tablet. Good afternoon, Christopher.
Good afternoon.
Just remind us who Cardinal Pell is and what kind of career he's had in the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, Cardinal Pell's one of the most prominent churchmen in the English-speaking world in the Catholic Church. He rose from Ballarat in Australia to the Vatican's treasurer, which is quite an extraordinary journey. And someone who really is one of the big beasts of the church over the years, and certainly on the more conservative side of the church, more of a culture warrior, and certainly had a big international following. As a result, he was certainly influential in Australia, controversial in Australia, but very well connected in Rome and with a lot of support in the United States.
And just remind us about the case against him that he was accused of, convicted of, and then acquitted.
So the cardinal was accused of serious sexual abuse allegations back in the mid-90s at a cathedral in Melbourne. The cardinal always denied those allegations. He was, as you say, convicted on the basis of this one accuser. The Court of Appeal in Victoria upheld the conviction, and then the High Court ruled that the jury should have had a doubt and overturned the conviction. The cardinal was due to face a second trial for allegations against him, but that fell apart due to lack of evidence. So, there have been people in the church, even those who disagree with the cardinal on theological positions, who found the allegations that he was convicted of implausible. It has split opinion in many places. I should just point out that the complainant, the only people to actually hear the full evidence of the complainant were the jury and the judges in the case. So it has been difficult to get a full picture of what he was accused of because of there was a media blackout and there was constrictions over who could hear all the evidence. But he has been acquitted and he's always denied the claims against him, which some people felt were implausible.
And has he been accepted back into the fold, so to speak?
Well, I think the cardinal still has supporters in Rome and in the Vatican in powerful places. Pope Francis, who has a very different view of the church to Cardinal Pell, has been loyal to the cardinal, has met him and has certainly been was certainly happy with what the cardinal was trying to do in terms of reforming Vatican finances. I think there are other people who are a bit more nervous because the cardinal is certainly a influential figure with a very loyal following, and there may be people in Rome who think that he's sort of positioning himself ahead of a future conclave to try and influence things in a more conservative direction. So there has been a welcome, but I would say it's pretty cautious.
Christopher, thank you very much. Christopher Lamb, Rome correspondent for the Roman Catholic Weekly, The Tablet there. Now, even before, as the headline writers have put it, Christmas was effectively cancelled in the UK because of this new variant of the coronavirus, the government was strongly advising people not to take full advantage of the relaxed restrictions on household mixing that were in place, but to exercise their social responsibility. Well, now mixing has been banned completely in London and South East England and severely limited in the rest of the country. Will people observe the rules and, more broadly and universally perhaps, what determines whether individuals keep to the rules and take risks in the current circumstances? Joining me now, two people who've been thinking about this. Professor Margaret Heffernan, an entrepreneur, author and professor at the School of Management at the University of Bath here in the UK, and Dan Ariely, professor of psychology and behavioural economics at Duke University in North Carolina in the United States. So welcome both to the programme.
Hi.
Dan, can I start with you? Some people have and presumably will continue to break the rules when it comes to COVID restrictions. Why do people break the rules when they know that it's potentially dangerous, not just to them, but to others?
So first of all, this is not an exception, that this is the only area that we break the rules. For example, have you ever texted while driving?
Of course not.
Okay, so you're one of the very few. Now, if you think about this, this is another case where people do something very dangerous and very stupid. Everybody knows it's dangerous and stupid. But one of the reasons that we text and drive is that we learn the wrong lesson. And here is what happens. Imagine that you think to yourself that the probability of texting and driving and dying is about 1%. And one day you drive and your phone vibrates and you are tempted to look at it, and you look at it, all the probability is only 1%. At the rationalization powers to say, I don't trust them, let me do what I feel like, right? It's not as if you lose trust, you all of a sudden start exercising and dieting a lot. when we lose trust, what we do is we use that as an opportunity to do what's fun for us rather than what's important. So that's point number one. Point number two is, who do we follow? And we follow the people that we see. But here it's also a little tricky because we see more bad behavior than good behavior. Like, imagine again, you're driving and 5 people are driving like crazy, way over the speed limit and so on. You notice those people. We notice the people who drive fast rather than all the people who drive at the speed limit. In the same way, when you walk around the street and some people obey the rules and some not, the people who are more salient are the one who are misbehaving, so you disproportionately think there are more of them.
I'm going to bring Margaret in. We've just got 30 seconds or so, Margaret, for a final observation.
Right. So I think the other thing, too, though, is that if you can give people really vivid illustrations of people doing the right thing, that can be as inspiring as the illustrations of people doing the wrong thing. So we know in the UK, for example, if you tell people everybody on their street paid their taxes on time, you increase the rate at which people pay their taxes on time. And unfortunately, the bad behavior, exactly as Dan says, has been very, very much more visible than the good behavior, which millions of people have made sacrifices to achieve.
Margaret Heffernan, Dan Ariely, fascinating stuff. Thank you both very much indeed. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, bringing you a powerful story of violence and abuse.
The last time I saw her was maybe February or March, and then she was officially missing in June.
Each year in the U.S., hundreds of Native American girls and women disappear.
We are trafficked, murdered, and raped at 5 to 10 times the national rate.
The perpetrators of these crimes are usually white.
In their mind frame, we are still savages and deserving targets of their violence.
And when it comes to investigating the abuse, the women are often failed by the authorities.
Unfortunately, law enforcement don't always do everything they're capable of doing.
I'm Leandra Neffin, and I'll be hearing how a new generation of warrior women is fighting back.
We're still in this modern-day cowboys versus Indian.
Missing and Murdered, America's Forgotten Native Girls, at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries.
A reminder of our top story this hour. Italy, Belgium and the Netherlands are banning travellers from Britain as fears grow about a new, more infectious variant of the coronavirus. Dr. Emma Hodcroft is an expert on viral genetics at the University of Bern. She told us that it's the speed at which the new variant is increasing that is worrying scientists and the government right now.
New variants arise all the time with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Mutating is part of virus life, but most of these mutations, they don't change the virus at all. So what brings scientists' eyes to pay more attention is when we see a variant growing kind of at a bigger rate than other viruses that are out there. And indeed, this is what we see in the south of England.
One other headline, the Nigerian security forces and a vigilante group have freed about 80 children from bandits, a second mass release in 3 days. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour, coming to you live from London with James Kamarasamy. Well, earlier in the programme, we heard from the drummers of Bethlehem's Scout Band. We're going to hear now from someone who marches to the beat of a rather different kind of drum and bass music. An example there of the music played by 22-year-old Will Kirk, who also has a big festive season ahead himself when he becomes the first profoundly deaf DJ on BBC's dance music station Radio 1 Extra. Will, who was diagnosed with hearing loss as a baby and who wears hearing aids, is among a group of guest presenters on the station. I asked him how it felt to make history.
It feels strange. That definitely feels surreal. It's not something that I expected. I am the first hearing impaired DJ, the first deaf DJ on BBC Radio 1. I have a severe to profound deafness. And to be doing this, it's quite amazing, but it's not something what ever really occurs to me. You know, being a deaf DJ and in general just being deaf and having my disability, you know, you don't let it hold you back. And I didn't start DJing to be a deaf DJ. I didn't start it to break any records. I did it because I wanted to do it, and it just so happens that I've managed to make history in the process.
Well, tell us, how did you start DJing?
I started DJing about 5 years ago now. On a whim, I bought a small set of DJ decks. It was about £30 online. And I just sort of worked my way up from there. I bought that on a whim, taught myself, and then I started to get more and more into dance music culture and eventually drum and bass music culture within that. And everything just sort of snowballed. It led into getting gigs. From there, I managed to get into radio and managed to start producing radio shows, as well as putting on my own nightclub night.
In that sense, perhaps quite a traditional way in, but as you say, you are not a traditional DJ because of your profound deafness. And tell us about music and how you've been experiencing it throughout your life and what it's meant for you.
I think that I'm very fortunate that I wear 2 ear-level hearing aids, and what they tend to do is they amplify the sound as well as change sounds that maybe I can't hear even when amplified so that I can hear them. And because of that, I've managed to be able to listen to music and enjoy music much the same as many others. But as I was just mentioning before, the hearing aid can change the sound slightly. So there's always this chance that if I was hearing, my favourite song might not actually be my favourite song because I hear it differently.
Oh, that's fascinating. And when you started listening to music, what was it that drew you to drum and bass?
I think it's sort of the energy and the atmosphere, particularly within a live environment. I started to get into it as I turned 18 and I was allowed to go to nightclubs and really experience it sort of live. And I think it's the community as well. It's such a great community. It's really open. It's really accepting. And I just sort of fell in love with the whole scene, not just the music.
And drum and bass music, for those that aren't aficionados like you, is there something about it that perhaps connects more with someone like you who does have hearing issues?
I think definitely. I think the main thing being within a nightclub environment, it's very bassy, so you can often feel the music as well as hear it. I, myself, am more deaf in high-pitched tones, so typically low register, what you tend to hear within quite a lot of drum and bass tracks. I can connect with more, possibly subconsciously. So I think it can definitely resonate with somebody who has hearing difficulties, more so than potentially other genres.
Will Kirk, soon to become the first deaf DJ on BBC Radio 1 Extra. Now, Argentina has just come out of one of the world's longest and strictest lockdowns following a severe economic crisis which began before the pandemic. That led many people to seek an alternative life in neighbouring Uruguay, where infection rates have remained low. Our South America correspondent Katie Watson reports.
Punta del Este is Uruguay's most famous beach resort, the summer playground of South America's rich and famous, especially from neighbouring Argentina. Then, when the warmer months are over, this tiny country of just 3.5 million people goes quiet. Not this year, though. 2020 was a little different. For real estate agents Marina Gutierrez and partner Michael, COVID-19 has been good for business. Argentinians wanting to escape a tough lockdown and head to a country with more freedom and lower infection rates, as well as a nice quality of life.
We're getting about 3 to 4 calls a day from people who want to move permanently, where before it was 3 to 4 calls per week. And the subject was renting or buying summer houses. Aside from residential properties, we're also getting inquiries about businesses and real estate development opportunities. Recently, for instance, we spoke with a businessman from Buenos Aires who's in the business of providing cranes to the construction industry, and he's working on having them shipped across the river so he can continue his business in Uruguay.
Sí, esa casa sigue a la venta, correcto?
According to Argentina's Ministry of Foreign Relations, between March and September, more than 30,000 Argentinians came to Uruguay. While that's far fewer than the 800,000 plus in the same period last year, bear in mind this wasn't tourism, because borders were shut for much of the year due to the pandemic. Those who had the means to leave Argentina could. and many are deciding to stay. According to the Uruguayan ambassador in Argentina, they're getting around 100 inquiries a week about residency permits.
Con su propia respiración, inhalando y exhalando, dejando que la respiración.
Yoga teacher Paula Peralta is one of the newcomers. She moved here with her family earlier this year.
We decided to come to Uruguay because we found the opportunity to do so. Living by the ocean had been a dream for a long while already, and since COVID and the possibility to work from home.
For Paula, she felt Argentina no longer allowed her the life she wanted for her children.
For already like 5 or 6 years, we've been thinking about moving out from the country, especially for letting our kids grow up in a more stable country, somewhere where you can plan ahead. We find Uruguay is quite close to our country. Our cultures are very, very, very similar. And also we were looking at a place where we could live more in nature, you know. So now we live by the sea and it's like a dream.
Uruguay is certainly encouraging people to make the move. The government's drastically lowered investment requirements to enable tax residency. And those who make the move to Uruguay are also allowed a 10-year tax holiday. Add to that the way Uruguay has managed to avoid the worst of the pandemic. The so-called New Zealand of South America is more appealing than ever.
And that was Katie Watson reporting. And that brings us to an end of this edition of News Hour. From me, James Kamara-Sami, and the team, goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, and James Copnell presents this month's World Questions.
After a revolution and the fall of a long-standing authoritarian government, Sudan is officially on the road to democracy. But is it moving fast enough? And when will standards of living start to improve? We'll be debating the most important issues facing Sudan, taking questions from people and putting them to leaders from across the country.
World Questions at bbcworldservice.com. And in an hour, The Forum with Bridget Kendall.
The ancient empire of Axum in northern Ethiopia was once hailed as one of the 4 great kingdoms on earth. But by the 9th century AD, it was no more. So what made it so powerful? And why did it decline?
Stay with us. The documentary is next, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Beethoven, the musical radical of the revolutionary age, who changed the course of musical history, but also famously lost his hearing. It turns out that his deafness wasn't the only ailment which tormented this iconic composer. I'm Georgia Mann, and I'm joined by eminent neurosurgeon Henry Marsh to tell Beethoven's story through the body which gave him so much trouble. Join us for Dissecting Beethoven, where we'll delve into everything from Beethoven's Autopsy, which revealed a liver like leather, to the possibility that he was drinking lead-laced wine. Dissecting Beethoven with me, Georgia Mann, and neurosurgeon Henry Marsh, after the news, here on the BBC World Service.
BBC News. Hello, I'm Tom Watt. Italy has joined the Netherlands and Belgium in announcing travel restrictions from Britain amid fears that a more contagious variant of the coronavirus might spread. Italy's foreign minister said it would be suspending flights. The Dutch government has already done so after detecting its first case of the new variant. Here's our Europe correspondent, Gavin Lee.
The news from the UK that the new variant of the virus could be 70% more transmissible than other strains is causing alarm across Europe. The Belgian Prime Minister, Alexander De Croo, said it was still unknown how far this strain had spread across the continent, but he said travel would be suspended for 24 hours to buy time for scientists to better understand the new threat. It means all flights and trains on the Eurostar and Eurotunnel will be cancelled both ways from midnight, and there'll be random checks of cars crossing over its borders. Germany, France and Italy are all said to be urgently considering a travel ban too.
With the new coronavirus strain having spread extensively in London and parts of southern England, Britain's Health Secretary has suggested tighter restrictions may be in place for the next couple of months. Matt Hancock acknowledged the variant was out of control. He said people in London and nearby areas had to act as if they all had the virus. Mr Hancock denied the government had not acted immediately when they learned of the new variant. As our political correspondent, Jessica Parker, reports.
Matt Hancock said ministers had acted quickly, suggesting the impact of the new variant had become clearer after a briefing from scientists on Friday. He defended the new Tier 4 lockdown, saying it was needed to save lives. The Health Secretary also suggested that the measures could last for some months yet, until the vaccine was more widely rolled out. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, accused Boris Johnson of leaving difficult decisions until the 11th hour because he didn't want to be unpopular. The Prime Minister's also faced criticism from his own backbenchers.
Police in Nigeria say they have rescued at least 84 children abducted in the northwestern state of Katsina on Saturday. Chris Iwaka reports from Abuja.
The students from an Islamic school were returning from the delayed celebrations of the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad when they were intercepted by some gunmen. Police in Katsina State said the students were rescued after security forces and local vigilantes engaged the bandits in a gunfight. This latest incident follows the release of 344 boys kidnapped from Government Science Secondary School on Friday.
The party of the Central African Republic's former president, Francois Bozizé, has denied he is trying to stage a coup. On Saturday, the government accused Mr Bozizé of marching with a rebel alliance on the capital Bangui a week before a general election. Opposition parties have called for next Sunday's vote to be postponed until peace is restored. Rebels are advancing on Bangui, seizing towns along the way. World news from the BBC. Sydney, Australia's largest city, is now isolated from much of the rest of the country as states and territories have imposed strict travel restrictions following a coronavirus outbreak. The states of Victoria and Queensland and the Northern Territory have banned people arriving from Sydney. Stephen Marshall, the Premier of South Australia, has also announced new COVID measures.
As of midnight tonight, anybody who has been in the Greater Sydney area will be required to complete 14 days of suitable quarantine on arrival. They will need to have testing on arrival, plus on day 5 and on day 12. Anybody who has been on the northern beaches will not be able to come in.
Household gatherings in Sydney are now capped at 10 people. Australia had gone for more than 2 weeks without a locally transmitted case. It's recorded just over 900 deaths since the pandemic began. The security forces in Belarus have been detaining more people as protests continue against the country's authoritarian leader, Alexander Lukashenko. Groups of people have gathered in different parts of Minsk to demand his resignation. They've been holding weekly demonstrations since Belarus's presidential election in August, which has been widely condemned as rigged. Elections for provincial administrations in Thailand have been held for the first time since their suspension in the wake of a military coup in 2014. Voters went to the polls in 76 areas outside Bangkok. The elections took place despite an increase in coronavirus infections. 7 ministers in Nepal have resigned in protest after the Prime Minister dissolved Parliament 2 years early amid infighting in the governing Communist Party. The 7 called the move undemocratic, as well as contrary to the constitution adopted after the abolition of the monarchy. The dissolution may face legal challenges. The Prime Minister, KP Oli, heads an unwieldy party that includes former Maoist insurgents. BBC News.
Beethoven. The composer who wrote these world-famous fatalistic notes, as well as this epically uplifting ode. Beethoven was born 250 years ago into a revolutionary age, the era of Napoleon. Beethoven's music was radical in its day and still has the ability to shock and awe us now. But most shocking of all is the fact that Beethoven lost his hearing. While he was writing symphonies like the one we're hearing now, he was marooned in an increasingly silent world. But might Beethoven also have suffered from
inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, manic depressive disorder, mercury poisoning, Whipple's disease?
What you're listening to is eminent neurosurgeon Henry Marsh, listing just a few of the conditions various medics have suggested Beethoven may have had.
Scleritis, hypochondriasis.
I'm Georgia Mann, and I talk on the radio a lot about the notes Beethoven wrote. But I wanted to tell his story through the body which gave him so much trouble. Given my complete lack of any medical qualifications whatsoever, I've asked Henry Marsh, a lifelong lover of Beethoven's music, to help me in Dissecting Beethoven. Because the man who changed the very anatomy of musical composition endured a host of symptoms, treatments, and now posthumous diagnoses.
Violent diarrhea. Treated him with leeches for headaches.
Placing horseradish in his ear.
Tests that showed that Beethoven had some kind of lead poisoning.
Congenital syphilis.
Bipolar disorder.
He may have felt this heart rhythm disturbance.
Poor Beethoven. Well, it's been strange attempting to dissect him against the backdrop of a global pandemic. Me and Henry were meant to start the story in Beethoven's birthplace of Bonn. Instead, I headed over to Henry's house in southwest London.
Georgia, good morning.
Good morning, Henry.
Come on in. Beethoven.
Beethoven it is.
Let's talk about Beethoven. One of the first EP, extended play, 45 RPM records my mother gave me when I must have been, I think I was only 9 or 10. Ironically enough, it was that one bit of music Beethoven wrote, which was the one thing was really successful in his life, but is now so completely frowned upon, which is the Battle of Victoria, Wellington's March.
That is the most, possibly the most OTT piece of music ever written.
Exactly. Well, I think my mother gave it to me because they had lots of guns going off and muskets and things. And then when I was at Oxford, at the age of 19, 20, I started listening to the late quartets. Now, I'm quite sure I did that for sort of, in almost sort of vain reasons. They were supposed to be very difficult and special, and it appealed to my sense of difficulty and challenge, which is also why I eventually became a neurosurgeon, same sort of reason. And I was very unhappy when I was at Oxford for silly reasons, and spent a short time in a psychiatric hospital, which was very beneficial to me. And when I came out, I put the Heilige Dankgesang on my turntable. And I sat there in my digs, I remember tears just streaming down my face. And it's fairly clear Beethoven wrote it in 1826, I think, certainly towards the end of his life. And he had been pretty ill. I mean, there are many aspects to Beethoven, but one I think I've always found so, being a rather emotional person myself, is this enormous sense of overcoming, of struggle and overcoming and resolution. And it doesn't take a great stretch to the imagination to see that is closely related to his terrible health.
It's interesting that the quartet Henry took such solace from at Oxford was the one Beethoven wrote after having to stare his mortality very much in the face. One thing I really wanted Henry's surgeon's perspective on, though, was something I stumbled across online: Beethoven's Autopsy. It was carried out the day after Beethoven died, aged 56, on the 27th of March 1827, by the brilliantly named Dr. Johannes Wagner. Yes, Wagner. He worked at Vienna's Pathology Museum, a museum that was set up under the auspices of one of Beethoven's own physicians, Dr. Frank, who had a particular interest in post-mortem procedure. The language Wagner uses is of the antiquated medical sort. At one point, he refers to being able to pass the quill of a goose through the excretory duct of Beethoven's pancreas. I was hoping Henry might be able to shed some light on Dr. Wagner's discoveries, starting with Beethoven's abdomen, which was described as being distended and swollen with fluid.
He undoubtedly had ascites, which is accumulation of fluid, and because of liver failure, in what's called the peritoneal cavity, which in technical terms is a potential space in front of the intestines. And we know he'd had the ascites tapped regularly by a barber surgeon in his last few months.
Tapped meaning?
Drained.
So
Drained.
he will have had a kind of tubey thing tapped into his...
Stuck a needle in and taken fluid out, yes.
Oh, OK.
Very simple procedure.
Let's think for a moment. You operate, Henry, at the absolute height of modern technical wizardry.
Yeah.
What was going on in the backdrop for Beethoven medicine-wise?
It was terrible. There had been progress in morbid anatomy, post-mortem's dissection. Their therapeutics was no progress at all. Basically, all the doctors had to go by was people's urine, their feces, and what they looked like. The only therapeutic manipulations were bleeding.
And leeches would have been
and leeches.
Right? Which we know Beethoven did endure at some point.
And particularly around the anus.
Leeches round the anus.
Yes,
truly delightful.
And it was completely wrong, and there were no effective drugs. The onus for cure was really put on the patient. The bit that makes no sense to me at all is the next bit, where he says that the acoustic nerves, the hearing nerves, were much, much thinner than normal, and the facial nerves, which are the nerves that control the muscles of the face, were much bigger than normal.
Yes.
Now, this makes absolutely no sense. And I say that as somebody who spent most of his professional life rootling around in this part of the skull with a microscope. The acoustic nerves are normally almost 10 times bigger than the facial nerves. The facial nerve is extremely small, very, very slender. I cannot see any reason why the facial nerves should be enlarged. And it seems to be much more likely that Wagner's confused the facial nerves and the acoustic nerves.
What about what's going on lower down the body? I know your thing is the brain, but the liver was reduced to half its normal size.
Yeah, well, it's shrunken with scarring because it's cirrhotic.
Was like leather, hard, and in colour slightly bluish-green.
Yeah, all that I think is consistent with cirrhosis.
So the main headline from Dr. Wagner's autopsy is that Beethoven's liver was in a diseased state at the end of his life. And there's been much speculation in the medical world about Dr. Wagner's findings regarding Beethoven's acoustic and facial nerves, but Henry reckons it could all be down to a simple muddling up on Wagner's part. Well, I wanted to get a sense of what Beethoven had been like as a patient, and one scholar who's explored that over the years is William Meredith, former head of the Beethoven Center at San Jose University in California. I asked William what, according to the historical evidence, were the main ailments Ludwig suffered from.
The first major one really is his deafness, which started around 1797 or 1798. And to this day, we still don't know what caused it. It might have been caused by another disorder that appeared at the same time, which is somewhat mysterious, were his abdominal problems. And he saw the doctor at roughly the same time for these. He also had fevers and headaches at the same time. And this continued actually throughout his life, this real serious problem with headaches. And then liver disease of some sort or other. He was jaundiced in 1821. And in 1825, he also had kidney failure. He also suffered from depression. Some medical doctors have concluded that he suffered from bipolar disorder. I actually think, having had several friends that have ADHD, that his characteristic behaviors resembled that more than bipolar disorder, but there was something very unusual about the way that his brain worked. It's interesting, I was reading that a couple of Beethoven's friends, at least a couple, said that he was a hypochondriac. But then when I was going through this list of symptoms, I was like, well, of course he was a hypochondriac. Who would not be a hypochondriac?
This does not paint a healthy picture, let's be real. What type of treatments, William, was he given?
The first doctor that he saw that we have a record of is called Dr. Frank. And this is when he was having these problems with his abdomen and the first signs of deafness. So he tried a treatment that actually people still use today, which is he would warm up olive oil and put it in his ears and then let it drain out. This is Dr. Vering. He did this very painful treatment where you use blisters on your arms. And Beethoven, it was incredibly painful, but Beethoven couldn't use his arms. He couldn't play the piano, so this was very distressing. So he wasn't happy with this doctor. Then his next doctor, who was his favorite, actually his only favorite, is Dr. Schmidt. And Dr. Schmidt is the one who sent him to Heiligenstadt in 1802 to spare his hearing. But he also treated him with leeches for headaches. The next doctor prescribed baths, which is Beethoven's doctors are going to keep doing that his whole life, is sending him to the baths. This has to do with one of the medical theories of the time, which is called humorism, which has to do with the four humors. And if the humors are out of balance, one of the ways to rebalance them was to go to these baths. You were immersed up to your neck into the water. They would also douche with the mineral water. They would give you massages. They would apply peat moss around the joints that were in trouble. And also an important part of it was either drinking or gargling the water. And then they would also insert the fluids into the vagina or the rectum, and sometimes they would use poultices.
I must say, I hadn't realised quite what an invasive experience the early 19th century spa could be. This is Dissecting Beethoven here on the BBC World Service with me, Georgia Mann, where we're anatomising the effect of Beethoven's poor health on the radical music he wrote. Another important place to look for clues about Beethoven's health is in his conversation books. By 1818, when Beethoven was in his late 40s, he'd started carrying blank booklets with him for his friends to jot down their sides of conversations while he answered aloud. There's everything from shopping lists to compositional sketches in those books, and there are a lot of them. They're being translated into English for the first time by Theodore Albrecht, Professor of Musicology at Kent State University, Ohio. So here's Theodore on the phone from Ohio describing one striking bit of medical advice Beethoven received.
Going back to 1807, 1808, there's a letter from Dr. Schmidt who says something on the order of, well, you can try leeches or you can try poultices, and there's someone who advises placing horseradish in his ears. Poor Beethoven.
The thought of Beethoven sitting at home with horseradish hanging out of his ear while trying to get piano concertos written is an odd one, and quite a sad one too, really. But there is evidence that Beethoven felt the numerous baths he was sent to did do him some good. Here's Henry Marsh on what might be behind that.
The other thing, which was only starting to be recognised at the beginning of the 19th century, was the importance of the placebo effect. There was an English doctor, Haygarth, who was more famous for work in smallpox inoculation, who showed this in Bath at the end of the 18th century. But actually the patient's beliefs were a hugely important factor for many symptoms, as to whether treatment worked or not. And you see this very strongly in Beethoven's letters and the conversation books, with the minimum of 14 doctors he got through. But then there's this terribly profound comment he makes in one of the conversation books. It is sad. Doctors do not know much. One tires of them eventually.
I'd tire of them too if they were applying leeches for headaches. But the one thing you see time and again in Beethoven's correspondence regarding his health is references to his troublesome bowels.
June 1801. Abdominal problems, colic and violent diarrhea. November 1805. Suffering colic pains, my usual complaint. September 1812. Not well since yesterday, caused by indigestible food.
OK, stop the music and gastrointestinal montage right there, because that comment of Ludwig's chimes with what I've been thinking about this matter. Just what on earth was Beethoven eating?
There's a remarkable series of daily menus in what was the most popular cookery book while he was in Vienna.
Food historian Ivan Day with some insights into Beethoven's Viennese diet.
A typical Sunday dinner would kick off with brown soup with dumplings, and the brown soup was based on a meat stock, followed by beef with caper sauce, and then a vegetable pops in, which is minced kohlrabi or turnips, and then there might be a pigeon pie followed by roast veal with salad. So the typical Viennese Sunday dinner was incredibly carnivorous, and that was the same for every day of the week. And I think we know now, better than they did in the early 19th century, that this wasn't particularly good for your uric acid levels in your bloodstream, and you would end up with all sorts of problems, like gout, for instance.
So basically, he might well have been eating meat, and more meat in his dinners. But one thing that we do know that Beethoven enjoyed, Ivan, was coffee. His biographer and friend Anton Schindler once said coffee seems to have been the one indispensable item in his diet. And apparently Beethoven always prepared his coffee himself, starting every day by counting out exactly 60 coffee beans and grinding them himself. Ivan, is this coffee habit unusual?
Well, not in Vienna at this time, because one published recipe to make it is very, very similar, in fact, in terms of the quantity. Now, this morning, I weighed out 60 coffee beans.
Wow.
And a bean weighs about 0.13 grams, so I ended up with just a little short of 8 grams, which is how much he would put in a cup. It made a cup of coffee, which was pretty strong. So I imagine he, liked it really potent and toxic. And I know his physician advised him in the later stages of his illness to cut down on his coffee drinking, because we know it's a stimulant and it does have a direct effect on his bowels. We know that.
The other thing we know Beethoven enjoyed drinking was wine. Remember Dr. Wagner's Autopsy revealing that leathery and bluish-green liver? Well, here's Henry on the phone to Theodor Albrecht, the man translating those many, many volumes of conversation books.
The other question is alcohol, of course. There's some fairly plausible evidence he may have died from alcoholic liver disease. Do the conversation books cast any light on that at all?
There is a certain sensitivity to alcohol going back to his grandmother on his father's side. His paternal grandfather was, of course, a bass singer and ultimately became choir director at the Electoral Court in Bonn. But his wife, Beethoven's grandmother, evidently had a certain fondness for the grape that was unhealthy. And, of course, that probably transferred to Beethoven's father. We get impressions that Papa was a great drunk. If there's any criticism of Beethoven's wine drinking, it even comes from his contemporaries who tell him to stay away from adulterated wine.
So there's some evidence that Beethoven's friends tackled him about his wine drinking in the conversation books, and there's certainly a family history of alcoholism. Here's Laura Tunbridge, whose book Beethoven, A Life in 9 Pieces came out earlier this year.
Beethoven drank heavily throughout his life and certainly enjoyed drinking, which was both a social thing for him and also just a regular occurrence. I mean, I think in some ways you have to put it in the context of what other people were doing in the late 18th and early 19th century. Generally, you didn't want to drink the water, and alcohol was around quite freely. So actually, although Beethoven probably drank more than a lot of people, he wasn't unusual in drinking regularly. Now, his doctors recommended that he cut back on drinking occasionally, which is actually quite unusual for the early 19th century because people are only just getting to grips with the medical consequences of drinking too much too often.
One of the stranger byways of the story of Beethoven's health is related to his drinking and to his hair. Here's William Meredith on what Beethoven's locks have revealed.
So the Beethoven Center bought a lock of hair that was said to be Beethoven's hair at Sotheby's in 1994. So some tests were done on that lock. That was a test that showed that Beethoven had some kind of lead poisoning. There's a doctor in Vienna who did tests on 3 locks that showed also lead poisoning, not just this one lock.
So how did the traces of lead get into Beethoven's hair? Well, some medics have suggested that it's to do with the wine he drank. So I went back to food historian Ivan Day. Beethoven couldn't seriously have been drinking lead-laced wine, could he?
Well, a lot of other people were too. Since antiquity, it's been known that if you boil concentrated grape juice, which is called must or sapa, in a lead vessel or you add a little bit of lead to it, you get a particular kind of material which was known as lead sugar. And this was used throughout Europe to rectify wines that were not particularly good. It tends to give them a better body and actually sweetens them a little bit. And sweet wines were pretty popular at this period. And it is likely that many people, without knowing it, were consuming this incredibly toxic substance. But whether he was or not, a lot of the wines that came into Vienna were brought in from Lower Austria, and they weren't of the best quality, and it's quite likely that some of the vintners were doctoring them with this lead tartarate material.
There was a very particular drink, Ivan, that was prescribed for Beethoven during his sadly painfully drawn out final weeks, and it always intrigues me every time I read about it. Dr. Malfatti, who was overseeing things by that stage of the game, suggested that Beethoven try frozen punch, and it seems to have had some effect. Seemingly he quite enjoyed it for a while, but then everything went wrong. I'm just intrigued by what on earth frozen punch, what that could be, or how that might have come about, why that would have been used to treat Beethoven at this stage.
Well, this is really remarkable because in 1775, a Neapolitan physician called Filippo Baldini published a book about the medicinal effects of sorbets and ice creams. It was called De Sorbetti, and he tells us that certain fruit punches, which were frozen, were brilliant for treating very, very persistent diarrhea and dysentery. And he tells us that these frozen dishes must be very appropriate in persistent diarrhea, as well as in the most obstinate dysentery caused by the lethargy of the vessels, which do not have sufficient elasticity, or from the continuous disunion in the internal membrane of the intestine.
This is the BBC World Service, revealing the Kenyan warriors who are now elephant caretakers.
We walk with them in the bush and we sleep with them in the night. That bond that we have is such strong. Sometimes they are not feeling well. You also feel like you are not okay.
This is a story about people and the animals they protect.
He lost a big part of his trunk. Unfortunately, he got beaten off by a hyena.
Diverse tribes and ethnic groups all coming together.
We have Turkana, we have Pokot, we have Somali, and we understand we were not in good relationship with them before because we normally fight because of our green pastures.
Hear how elephants became a catalyst for peace. With me, Michael Kaloki.
All those elephants has brought us together.
Warrior Elephant Guardians, Tuesday at 9:20 GMT.
After the news, we continue to explore Beethoven's story through the body he had so many problems with. What does our resident neurosurgeon Henry Marsh make of the lead poisoning theory? And what makes one American medic think the answer to some of Beethoven's most persistent symptoms was congenital syphilis? That's coming up in Dissecting Beethoven with me, Georgia Mann, after the news here on the BBC World Service.
BBC News. Italy has become the latest European country to introduce travel restrictions on British travellers over fears about a new, highly transmissible variant of coronavirus. The Netherlands has already banned passenger flights from Britain, and Belgium is closing its borders to British travellers for an initial 24-hour period from midnight. The Health Secretary in London, Matt Hancock, has suggested the capital could remain in lockdown for some months to contain the spread of the new variant. He acknowledged it was out of control. Tighter restrictions have come into force in Australia's largest city, Sydney, to control a coronavirus outbreak affecting the Northern Beaches area. Household gatherings will be capped at 10 people. Police in Nigeria say they have rescued at least 84 children abducted by gunmen in the northwestern state of Katsina on Saturday. It is a second mass release in 3 days. The party of the Central African Republic's former president, Francois Bozizé, has denied he is trying to stage a coup a week before the general election. The government had accused Mr. Bozizé of marching on the capital with Rebel Alliance, but his spokesman said he was in his house in Bosangwa. Turkish-backed fighters in northeastern Syria have announced a new offensive in a region controlled by the mainly Kurdish militia that led the fighting against the Islamic State group. The Free Syrian Army said it would move on the town of Ain Issa and its surroundings in the coming hours. The security forces in Belarus have been detaining more people as protests continue against President Alexander Lukashenko. There have been weekly demonstrations since a discredited election in August. And coronavirus restrictions in Ireland have prevented crowds from travelling to the Neolithic Passage tomb at Newgrange to witness the moment that sunlight floods its chamber. The annual phenomenon at the winter solstice was streamed online instead. BBC News.
This is Dissecting Beethoven here on the BBC World Service, a look at the world-famous composer through the ailments he struggled with throughout his life. We just heard that traces of lead which have been found in Beethoven's hair could be down to the fact that the wine he enjoyed drinking in early 19th century Vienna may well have had lead in it as a preservative of sorts. My dissection partner, the neurosurgeon Henry Marsh, has some reservations about that idea, though.
Hair grows, so lead levels in hair only reflect what's been happening to you in the preceding 2 or 3 months. I think the interest is, did he have chronic lead poisoning? Because some of the symptoms of chronic lead poisoning doesn't cause cirrhosis, but it can cause long-term gastrointestinal problems.
OK.
We don't know what the normal lead levels were in people in his contemporaries. So I think it's all a bit dubious. But again, there was this attempt, I think, to try to find a single diagnosis to explain many of his symptoms. Lead can also make you go mad.
The tests on Beethoven's hair and the clues we find in Dr. Wagner's Autopsy, as well as the numerous often tortured descriptions in Beethoven's own correspondence, have led to legions of doctors and medics theorising on what diagnoses could explain his symptoms and the fairly unhealthy body which Dr. Wagner dissected in 1827. Henry mentioned there that some doctors have suggested illnesses which would explain a group of Ludwig's symptoms, like our next medic, Philip Mackowiak, Professor Emeritus at the Maryland School of Medicine.
In particular, I'm attracted to the diagnosis of congenital syphilis, syphilis that was introduced into the family bloodline by his father, who was a major reprobate. Syphilis, as far as we know, and as far as the evidence that I'm aware of indicates, was brought back from the New World by Columbus. It just absolutely raged throughout Europe. It produced a disorder that had never been seen before in the Old World, and it was rampant at that time. Beethoven's case in particular, there are 2 problems that he had that are particularly characteristic of congenital syphilis. One is his deafness. It is a strange deafness in today's terms in that it began slowly and progressed over about 25 to 30 years.
Does it also encompass things like the kind of bowel problems that Beethoven had and the liver issues that he ended up with at the end of his life?
Yes, it would. The bowel problems are a common complaint among patients with syphilis, both acquired and congenital forms, and are associated with abdominal pain and diarrhea.
And we're back with Beethoven's bowels again. That was Professor Philip Mackowiak, whose congenital syphilis idea does at least explain some of Beethoven's most persistent symptoms. So I suggested to Henry Marsh that it wasn't so far-fetched, was it?
Well, I mean, we come to the fundamental problem. We have no modern diagnostic knowledge about Beethoven's health. It's largely guesswork. Secondly, syphilis used to be called the great imitator, in which case you can claim any symptom could be caused by syphilis. So it doesn't mean very much. As to congenital syphilis, I mean, there's not very much. It's very rare nowadays, as I couldn't find very much written about it in contemporary literature. But I mean, you get a whole cluster. It's very rare for it to present in adulthood, though it can. It's possible, but it seems pretty unlikely to me.
So, Henry's not convinced by Professor Mackowiak's congenital syphilis theory, but I'd come across some research from another group of American medics and musicologists which centred around Beethoven's heart. They explored the theory, which has been around for a while, that Beethoven may have suffered from cardiac arrhythmias or an irregular heartbeat. I went back to Dr. Wagner's Autopsy, and the closest he got to Ludwig's heart was a reference to the thoracic cavity, which he said was normal, before moving on to the far more worrying-sounding gallbladder, containing a dark-coloured fluid, and a spleen twice the normal size. Anyway, back to Beethoven's heart. Here's Dr. Zachary Goldberger, an expert in cardiovascular medicine based in Wisconsin, on some of what he's described as Beethoven's musical electrocardiograms.
Well, we looked at the initial one that was posited by many, the piano sonata in E-flat major, which opens up with a very powerful syncopation and sort of a galloping rhythm. We also found that other examples may be in the fifth movement, or the cavatina movement of the string quartet in B-flat major, opus 130. If you look at the score closely, it starts off with this German word marked as beklemmt, which is translated into English as heavy of heart. You have a composer writing heavy of heart, directly onto the score. You could think, well, that is certainly emotion, but that could also be speculatively extrapolated to having, a sensation of squeezing of the chest, which is also associated with shortness of breath, and that may be a manifestation that people oftentimes feel when they have irregular heart rhythms, is sort of a chest tightness.
Well, listening to that moment from Beethoven's Cavatina, I could find myself almost holding my breath. And now that Dr. Goldberg has mentioned it, it is intriguing that Beethoven turned to heart-related references in his score markings. So what does our resident neurosurgeon make of this idea, then?
What I'd like to know is if you look at other composers' music, whether you could find similar episodes. I mean, look at Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Now, does that fit a cardiac arrhythmia, for instance?
Yes.
So I'd like to know what the base case is, So just looking at Beethoven alone, I'm unconvinced. Technically, I can't judge.
So we've talked about the possibility of Beethoven's liver disease being the result of alcoholism. He probably had irritable bowel syndrome, but his diet probably wasn't helping him much. But what questions has our dissection thus far raised for you, Henry?
The main questions for me, I'm afraid, is coming back to the deafness and the impact that had on him, as much psychologically as well as what it did for his composing of music. And from my family experience of deafness, there's deafness on my first wife's side of the family. One of my daughters is severely deaf. It is a huge handicap, socially above all.
Well, one place where Beethoven bears his soul about this very problem is the Heiligenstadt Testament. It's some of the most moving writing I've ever come across on what it's like to experience a progressive illness with no hope of a cure. Here's Beethoven biographer Laura Tunbridge.
He writes it in 1802. He had been spending time in the village of Heiligenstadt. He did this quite often, partly on the advice of doctors and partly to recuperate from being in the city. He'd spend months in villages or in spa towns. He writes this letter, which is addressed to his brothers, and in it he explains, in part, why he's been so difficult to deal with.
Oh, you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. Think that for 6 years now I have been hopelessly afflicted, made worse by senseless physicians, from year to year deceived with hopes of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady, whose cure will take years or perhaps be impossible.
One interesting thing about it is that when he writes it, it's partly because he's decided that actually life still is worth living, and he is going to continue composing, and it's music that's going to save him.
It was only my art that held me back. It seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me.
The interesting thing about it is that he didn't send it. And so this is a document that he kept and was discovered after his life. And that becomes part of the biographical understanding of Beethoven's life, the kind of posthumous understanding of Beethoven's life, because it becomes apparent that he was struggling with deafness from much earlier on than people had realised. And obviously the challenges of that was something that made people feel much more sympathetic towards Beethoven, who had been quite a difficult character.
If he did have ADHD, it's interesting because one of the characteristic descriptions of Beethoven's music during his lifetime was that it was bizarre.
William Meredith on what he thinks might be behind that perception that Laura talked about of Beethoven being difficult.
The Germans like to use the French word when they did that intentionally because, of course, bizarre things come from abroad. What they meant was it had a very specific musical meaning, not like the regular meaning, which was that the melody went in surprising ways and that you couldn't predict what was happening with it. And indeed, that's a description of a lot of Beethoven's music, is that it's just very surprising. I think that people with ADHD and bipolar disorder, they see the world in a different way. And I think that that is reflected in his music, because a lot of the music is bizarre. In fact, it's so bizarre that in the 1820s, people were thinking that Beethoven maybe had gone completely mentally ill.
And some of the works prompting the critics to suggest that Beethoven had taken leave of his senses were his late string quartets, which contain some of his most experimental and soul-bearing music. It's also where we find Beethoven's most explicitly health-related piece, the Heiliger Dankgesang movement of the Opus 132 quartet, written as a song of holy thanksgiving for his recovery after an illness which nearly killed him and involved some pretty excruciating gastrointestinal pain. This is Dissecting Beethoven on the BBC World Service with me, Georgia Mann, where we're exploring the impact of Beethoven's bodily struggles on the game-changing music he wrote. I asked the Brodsky String Quartet to come into the BBC's Maida Vale studios and play some moments where they think Beethoven's body and mind are particularly present in his music. Here's cellist Jacqueline Thomas and viola player Paul Cassidy.
We've chosen 4 extracts. Round about Opus 95, in terms of the string quartet, things really start getting serious. And Opus 95 is entitled Serioso.
So it's written in 1810, and we know he was less than happy with the world around him at the time because lots of his friends had moved out of Vienna, Napoleon's invading for a second time in 4 years, and Beethoven was none too pleased about it. What sense do we get of Beethoven in this music?
I think the most striking thing of this movement, and in fact of the whole piece, is how truncated it is. Every aspect of it is cut down, almost as if he's angry. You know, he's just losing his temper, he's throwing out phrases willy-nilly and everything's exploding out off the page. It's kind of bad-tempered.
I remember the first time I ever heard Opus 95, in bar 5, I burst into tears in bar 5. You know, so like he didn't save it for the, bar 32 or 64. So from the explosive opening, he immediately turns the corner and there's this heartbreaking little moment, One can't imagine what it must have been like to be a composer, to be a musician, and to have lost your hearing. I mean, apart from the obvious thing, he was no longer able to take part in music. So that whole side of things. Because Beethoven played the viola, like all
Just
those
like
great
all
composers.
The great people, like you, Paul.
But he would have loved the camaraderie like we all do.
We're also going to hear a movement from the Opus 135 quartet. So this was written, I think, a year before he died, and he marks in the manuscript, Muss es sein, must it be? There is something incredibly inquisitive, but kind of almost painfully inquisitive in the music here.
Yeah, we introduced the Muss es sein motive, the viola and cello, very low down. And yes, it's answered by something quite lyrical. Then screeching violins and lots of choking sounds. He himself says that the very important question, and of course the release that comes with the main movement, and the joyousness just explodes, and yes, it must be, is very much a release.
We're also going to hear you play the cavatina from the Opus 130. And this is just such intensely emotional music. This is one of the pieces that was sent into outer space on the Voyager space probe as an example of one of humanity's great achievements. But what do you think is at the crux of the cavatina?
I find it pretty sad, I have to say. It's extremely difficult to play, and I think that we have the accompaniment is the difficulty. Because if you disturb it, if your notes stick out in any way, when they're not supposed to, it destroys the overall feel. It's a difficult movement.
Why do you think, particularly as Beethoven's getting to the end of his life, and certainly his hearing loss is becoming more and more pronounced, why does he turn to string quartets to the extent that he does? Because it really feels like this is the form, this is the place where he is bearing his soul and expressing himself more than anywhere else.
Because string quartets are the rock bands of classical music.
Hell yes.
They are, the string quartet, whether you like it or not, is an amazingly powerful force.
With that Heilige Dankgesang movement, holy song of thanksgiving of a convalescent to the deity, it's written 2 years before Beethoven's death. He'd been suffering from an illness which we know involved some really agonising gastrointestinal pain. How do you convey that sense of suffering in those moments in that quartet where it's so suspended?
It takes a huge amount of bow control. It's very difficult for the ensemble. One has to constantly be listening and watching everyone else, and trying to make the chord changes together so that it really does feel almost like an organ playing. We're building crescendi together, we're trying to move together.
For me, just the thought that someone in his state could write anything, to put your mind to anything when you're in that sort of state is a violinist. It was Schuppanzi, who's the first violin of that quartet that premiered a lot of Beethoven's works. He once said to Beethoven, this is ridiculous. I mean, how do you expect me to play this? This is beyond the realms of possibility. And Beethoven apparently just said, what do I care for your wretched fiddle when the gods are speaking to me? He was aware of what was going on.
The Brodsky Quartet, playing from Beethoven's Heilige Dankgesang movement of the Opus 132 string quartet. Henry Marsh, you spoke at the start of this programme when we were sitting in front of your fire, and it feels like a long time ago now, about listening to that piece as a young man at Oxford after a stay in a psychiatric hospital in tears. What does it say to you now when you hear it?
Well, unfortunately, while we were making this programme, I've been diagnosed with very serious prostate cancer, not the sort you live with for years and maybe die with without needing treatment. And this is all sort of blown up just in the last few weeks, so I've had to confront my own mortality with a vengeance. And of course, the Heilige Dank Gesang is about recovery. I think it's thought he'd had an episode of jaundice. And I tried to listen to the recording of the Brodskys playing. I couldn't. I'm not ready for this because I don't know if I will recover. Obviously, I hope I will. And I hope one day I'll be able to listen to it again in that frame of mind, if rather grisly treatment I now require is successful. It is, I think, one of the most powerful pieces of music ever written. It's utterly extraordinary.
We wanted to explore just how central Beethoven's hearing loss was to the rest of his health and well-being. And if there's one person who can offer an insight into that, it's the composer Richard Ayers, whose piece, number 52, 3 pieces about Ludwig van Beethoven, dreaming, hearing loss and saying goodbye, was performed at this year's BBC Proms by the Aurora Orchestra. In it, Richard takes inspiration from Beethoven, but also explores his own hearing loss.
In the first piece, it was a sort of elegy for what will disappear eventually from my own world. The way things become vague or unclear, and I can't really tell what's happening. So a lot of that first movement, I can't hear myself because it's, lots of high strings and quiet things.
The other question, which I find very interesting, because I said there's deafness in my first wife's family and in one of my daughters, is the sort of social and psychological impact of that. My own view is I suspect, and actually Beethoven says it in the Heiligenstadt Testament, that it made him very difficult and grumpy, even a bit paranoid. And do you have personal experience of that as well?
Yes, that's definitely my experience. I mean, I stopped going to concerts, I stopped going to see friends in noisy places or going out for it. I used to go out every day for it and meet friends in the cafe and things, and that just doesn't happen anymore.
And forgive the personal nature of the question, but did you go through a period of deep despair about this in the way that Beethoven undoubtedly did, having to come to terms with this, or was it a more gradual process?
I've gone through this as a sort of stepwise process of realizing my limitations and then having a grieving period and then getting on with it and then having another realization that things have changed.
But you haven't been reduced to conversation books and weird ear trumpets like poor Beethoven.
No, things have changed. Thank goodness. I have hearing aids. I have headphones which work on the bone of my jaw. These kind of things all help.
One sense I always get of Beethoven's music is the physicality of it. It's such a kind of all or nothing feel that it has. Do you get a sense of physicality in his music, of his body being within it somehow, or him really forcing the musicians to really, really use theirs?
I think that's a result of the deafness. The things have to be larger than life. So the musical lines must stand out and with clarity and with energy. If you can't hear the things entirely, you rely on the energy of the musicians to express things as well. And I feel that's what he was doing. He could pick up on their energy, their body movements, the way they attack the instrument.
Your piece, which we heard at the proms, so cleverly creates this kind of disconcerting feeling at times, this taking us into a mind where sound is unreliable or blurry. Has music helped you to overcome those feelings, that kind of disconcerting sense of hearing loss, or does it heighten it?
It heightens it, unfortunately. But that can be a good thing in that I think my music's more vivid. Every day I work, I understand what I can't hear anymore.
Again, forgive the personal nature of the question, Richard, but with your hearing loss, is it something that's likely to worsen in the future or not?
I'm getting ready for it to gradually disappear. To be honest, it's more of a social problem in a social context than compositional, because I compose in my head and my imagination, and that's very strong.
Henry Marsh, I found that conversation with Richard very moving, and interesting that the search we've had on for Beethoven's body in all his music does tend to lead us back to this one all-encompassing problem, his hearing.
Yes, and what was fascinating was the way Richard said in some ways his composing had been almost improved by his deafness, because he had to imagine it all. And that struck me as a remarkable insight, which surely applies to Beethoven.
Talking to Richard Ayers has made me realise just how all-encompassing that most terrifying of all ailments for Beethoven, his hearing loss, really must have been. As Richard says, that pulsing, vivid physicality that Beethoven demands in players and elicits in listeners could well have come down to his need to see it, to have a sense of that energy so it could live on in his imagination. And perhaps imagination is where our dissection leads us ultimately, because it wasn't only his deafness that shaped Beethoven's music. We've delved into his body, from the diseased liver and distended abdomen which Dr. Wagner found the day after his death, to the mysterious lead-laced locks of his hair. All of Beethoven's physical struggles are undoubtedly written into his music. But what makes Beethoven so unique is perhaps the way that the worlds of the body and the imagination collide.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're looking at how money has come to rule human values in this year's Wreath Lectures.
In his final lecture, Mark Carney focuses on the pressing issue of climate change.
Society wants the climate crisis solved, but how do we channel the market in service of society?
Do the roots of our environmental emergency lie in a deeper crisis of values?
The Wreath Lectures, Wednesday at 10 GMT. And in an hour, we join Delith Lloyd for Sports World,
where we'll bring you build-up and full match commentary of the day's biggest game in the English Premier League between Manchester United and Leeds United from Old Trafford. Plus, we'll be live in the US, where Saul Canelo Alvarez won the WBA World Super Middleweight title overnight.
On air, online and on mobile, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Since the presidential election in August, which has been condemned as rigged. And coronavirus restrictions in Ireland have prevented crowds from travelling to the Neolithic Passage Tomb at Newgrange to witness the moment that sunlight floods its chamber. The annual phenomenon at the winter solstice was instead streamed online. BBC News.
Welcome back to NewsHour. Palestinian Christians are preparing for Christmas celebrations in Bethlehem, despite a surge in COVID
The Dutch
cases
government
in the
has
West
already
Bank.
done so after
Midnight
detecting
Mass
its
at the
first
Nativity
case of the
Church
new
on
variant.
Christmas Eve will take
Germany
place
has said
without
it
a
is
congregation.
evaluating flight restrictions. Here's our Europe correspondent, Gavin Lee.
The news from the UK that the new variant of the virus could be 70% more transmissible than other strains is causing alarm across Europe. The Belgian Prime Minister, Alexander De Croo, said it was still unknown how far this strain had spread across the continent, but he said travel would be suspended for 24 hours to buy time for scientists to better understand the new threat. It means all flights and trains on the Eurostar and Eurotunnel will be cancelled both ways from midnight, and there'll be random checks of cars crossing over its borders.
Britain's Health Secretary has suggested tighter restrictions introduced in and around London may be in place for the next couple of months. Matt Hancock acknowledged the variant was out of control. He said people in parts of England placed in a new higher category of restrictions had to act as if they all had the virus. He rejected claims the government had been too cowardly to give people bad news earlier and had then made a U-turn.
We have to bring in an effective lockdown in large swathes of England because of a new variant strain that's being seen here and in some other countries around the world in order to save lives. I totally understand how people are frustrated at the situation and disappointed. Of course I do.
Sydney is now isolated from much of the rest of Australia as states and territories have imposed strict travel restrictions following a coronavirus outbreak. The states of Victoria and Queensland and the Northern Territory have banned people arriving from Sydney. Stephen Marshall, the Premier of South Australia, has also announced new COVID measures.
As of midnight tonight, anybody who has been in the Greater Sydney area will be required to complete 14 days of suitable quarantine on arrival. They will need to have testing on arrival, plus on day 5 and on day 12. Anybody who has been on the northern beaches will not be able to come in.
Household gatherings in Sydney are now capped at 10 people. Australia had gone for more than 2 weeks without a locally transmitted case. It's recorded just over 900 deaths since the pandemic began. Batches of the Moderna vaccine have been leaving warehouses heading for healthcare facilities across the United States. The Moderna vaccine, which was given approval on Friday, is being distributed to nearly 4,000 locations, vastly broadening the rollout started by its Pfizer counterpart. Some states are choosing to use the Moderna shot for harder-to-reach rural areas because they can be stored in standard refrigerators. World news from the BBC. Police in Nigeria say they have rescued at least 84 children abducted in the northwestern state of Katsina on Saturday. From Abuja, Chris Iwaka reports.
The students from an Islamic school were returning from the delayed celebrations of the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad when they were intercepted by some gunmen. Police in Katsina State said the students were rescued after security forces and local vigilantes engaged the bandits in a gunfight. This latest incident follows the release of 344 boys kidnapped from Government Science Secondary School on Friday.
The party of the Central African Republic's former president, Francois Bozizé, has denied he is trying to stage a coup. On Saturday, the government accused Mr. Bozizé of marching with a rebel alliance on the capital Bangui a week before a general election. His spokesman said he was not in the bush but in his house in Bosangwa. President Touadéra has insisted the poll will go ahead. Turkish-backed fighters in northeastern Syria have announced a new offensive in a region controlled by the mainly Kurdish militia that led the fighting against the Islamic State group. The Turkish faction, which still goes under the name of the Free Syrian Army, said it would move on the town of Ain Issa and its surroundings in the coming hours. 7 ministers in Nepal have resigned in protest after the Prime Minister dissolved Parliament 2 years early amid infighting in the governing Communist Party. The 7 called the move undemocratic, as well as contrary to the constitution adopted after the abolition of the monarchy. The dissolution may face legal challenges. And coronavirus restrictions in Ireland have prevented crowds from travelling to the Neolithic Passage tomb at Newgrange to witness the moment that sunlight floods its chamber. The phenomenon, which occurs for a number of days at the winter solstice each year, was instead streamed live online. BBC News.
sound of the legendary chants of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, said to be composed some 1,500 years ago by Saint Yaret, a pioneer of traditional music. He lived in the city of Aksum in the highlands of northern Ethiopia, at the heart of what was then the Axamite Empire. Today, this Tigray region of northern Ethiopia is in the news because of a conflict that's broken out between the region and forces loyal to the federal government. But go back to the 3rd century AD, and the kingdom of Axum was one of the earliest Christian states in the world and one of the most important trading hubs in northeast Africa. In fact, the Persian prophet Mani named the Axumite Empire as one of the 4 great kingdoms on earth, together with Persia, Rome, and China. But despite its power and reputation, we're only now beginning to understand more about the lives of the people who lived there. I'm Bridget Kendall, and today on the forum from the BBC World Service, we'll be discussing what archaeology can tell us about the ancient Axumite Empire. I'm joined by 3 guests. Helena Solomon Waldekiris is Assistant Professor of Archaeology at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. Also in the US is Felga Salam Solomon Yirga. He's Assistant Professor of History at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And Niall Finneran is a reader in Historical Archaeology and Heritage Studies at the University of Winchester in the UK. He's the author of The Archaeology of Ethiopia. Welcome to all 3 of you. And let's start by asking, who were the Axamites? Helena, where exactly were they based?
The Axamites were based in the North Ethiopian highlands and the Eritrean highlands. At the height of their empire, they also included parts of Sudan and parts of South Arabia, which is modern-day Yemen. They also included some countries in the Horn of Africa, Djibouti, and Somalia.
And Felga, who were the people? What was the language that they spoke?
In terms of the language that they spoke, it's sort of rather difficult to know what most people were speaking, but we do have inscriptions that give us a sense that in the royal court, Ge'ez, or Classical Ethiopic, was the primary spoken and written language, and the language that appears on inscriptions. They were also familiar with the Sabaic alphabet, which is from South Arabia, and it seems as though the king and many members of the court were familiar with ancient Greek.
And Niall, what period are we talking about when we talk about the Axumite Empire?
Well, the chronologies vary, and this is important to understand in relation to Axum, that you have an internal Ethiopian tradition that has a sort of longer chronology. And it's only recently, with the extensive excavation of the sites in and around Axum, tying into radiocarbon dating, tying into pottery sequences, and tying into coinage sequences and pulling all of those elements of information together, that we're starting to refine it. So in very, very broad terms, and I mean in very broad terms, the Axumite Empire essentially is from the 1st century BC and going through to the 7th and 8th centuries AD, but there are nuances and there are subdivisions within that overall chronology.
Okay, so we've got a very broad picture here, Helena, but do we know how the empire first came about?
So we know the Axumite Empire originated from a pre-existing empire called the Pre-Axumite or the Damat Kingdom. So the Pre-Axumites called themselves the Damat, and we know they were positioned in the highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and they were highly agrarian society, well-settled farming communities.
And do we know how the empire came about, how one evolved into the other?
Yes, we do. So we know the first settlement or the political capital of the Pre-Axumite was in the area where we call the Yaha region. There we have good evidence of settled elite communities practicing their own local religion. We have good classification of differentiation in terms of specialization, social stratification based on burial systems, and so on.
And Felga, how do we know that the Axumite kingdom was a kingdom ruled by a series of kings?
Well, the inscriptions are a very good indication of this. So they typically begin with the name of the king followed by, a notification that he is the king of the Axumites, and then he lists other subject peoples Now, who these subject peoples are is sometimes in question, and some of the claims may be political fictions. But one thing we can regularly sort of sort out is that the Axamite kings declared themselves kings of Aksum and sort of had tributary relationships with their neighbors. And they were often quite aggressive with their neighbors as well, so it's a sort of expansionist empire. As to whether this expansion has to do with territory or with other things such as punitive campaigns or seizing slaves and cattle, this is a little more unclear.
Okay, Niall, you talked a little bit about evidence, but how do we know about the Axamites? What is the archaeological evidence that survives?
Well, in a sense, it skewed the picture, and this is the problem with archaeology as a whole, not just within Africa, but elsewhere. One tends to go for the stuff that looks really big, which tends to be associated with the elites within a given society. So, for example, at Axum, from the 16th century AD, when the first Portuguese travellers came to Axum and sort of noticed the stele, these monumental standing multi-storied stone structures at Axum, it's been the elite material that has caught the eye. And subsequently, generations of archaeologists have approached Axum and looked at the big stuff, basically. They've looked at the monumental tombs, they've looked at the inscriptions and so forth. But it's only really been recently that archaeologists have turned their attention to the more domestic underpinnings of the Axamite polity. And that was certainly the case on the project that I worked with the British Institute in Eastern Africa at Axum in the 1990s, where we looked for the first time at lower status settlement. So in broad terms, moving outside of Axum as well, we're starting to get a better picture of the pattern of Axamite settlement across this area of northern Ethiopia and into Eritrea. There is still, however, that skewed element where we tend to focus in on the sort of monumental stuff at the expense of the domestic.
Yes, the monumental stuff has certainly been very visible and quite political, hasn't it? Isn't there one of these stele which was taken to Italy by Mussolini in the 20th century and only just returned to Ethiopia a few years ago?
Well, Stela II is interesting because Stela II was toppled at some point in antiquity, so it was always recumbent, it was always lying down and broken. And then what happened was that you'll be aware that the Italian-Ethiopian War, in 1937, Mussolini, as a very symbolic act, took Stela II back to Rome. Now, Stela II is 24 metres long, it's 170 tonnes, it's a big chunk of stone. It was taken by sea to Rome and it stood in the plaza in Rome for a number of years, and there were various discussions around the repatriation of Stela II. And this was going on in the background when we were working on our BIEA project at Axum. We looked at the original settings for the Stela and we found in the backfill lots of Italian beer bottles, so we sort of knew we were working in the right place. Slowly the plan came together to repatriate Stela II, and happily this happened back in 2008 on the 4th of September. They had to extend the runway at Axum to bring in these huge Antonov transport planes to bring the sections together. And the sections originally had been pinned together using iron supports, which was found to be quite unsatisfactory. So now the Stela has been re-erected using sort of plastic Kevlar on its original site. But I would say with this return of the Stela, it may have put its neighbouring stele at risk with sort of destabilising some of the foundations there. So there are conservation issues with this, but certainly the return of the stele to Axum is part of a bigger narrative of the repatriation of African cultural items back to Africa.
We've talked a bit about the archaeology then, and particularly these huge monumental pieces, but there are also a number of contemporaries who wrote about the Axamites. Can you tell us more about these textual sources, Feliger?
Yes, the Axamites came to the attention of the sort of wider Mediterranean world in the 1st century CE, and we have a great number of writers from the Roman and later Byzantine world who mention them. I think the most substantial discussion would be one by a writer named Kosmas Indikoplaustis, who wrote about trade in Axum and also recorded the inscription on the side of a throne. We also have an account preserved by Procopius, who was a writer in the court of Justinian I in the 6th century AD, that discusses diplomatic relations between the Axumites, the Himyarites, and the Byzantine Empire. Beyond that, you find lots of small mentions throughout the corpus of Greek and Latin texts, and I believe also one account of a diplomatic discussion from an author, Nonosis.
And what do we learn from these texts? What does it tell us about the sort of place it was?
It gives us some sense of a great deal of importance, at least that the people in the Mediterranean believed, that the role the Axamites had in terms of trade. So it's identified initially through its port of Adulis as an important trade port, as a sort of way station on the way to markets in the Indian Ocean. And there seems to have been, I guess, some degree of respect between the sort of emperor of the Byzantines and the emperor of the Axamites. We have an account preserved, a letter preserved from Constantius II, sent in the 4th century AD, which speaks of the Axamite king Izana as a brother.
As Feliga said, the Axamite port of Adulis in what's now Eritrea was an important trading centre, and it's mentioned in the 1st century AD Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a kind of logbook for sailors, as an important marketplace for ivory. Here's its description of the port of Adulis.
Opposite Mountain Island, on the mainland, 20 stadia from shore, lies Adulis, a fair-sized village, from which there is a 3 days' journey to Kolo, an inland town, and the first market for ivory. From that place to the city of the people called Axamites, there is a 5 days' journey more. To that place all the ivory is brought from the country, beyond the Nile, through the district called Cyaneum, and thence to Adulis. Practically the whole number of elephants and rhinoceros that are killed live in the places inland, though at rare intervals they are hunted on the seacoast, even near Adulis.
Well, today there are no rhinoceros and only a handful of elephants in that part of the world. But at that time, as we just heard, ivory was a big export. Helena, can you tell us what other goods were flowing through this port and whom the Axamites were trading with?
Yes, so the Axamites were trading and exchanging with a number of people within Africa, but also outside Africa, because of their location in the Horn of Africa, which is a nexus for trade and exchange. And we know the types of imports and exports that were going on through the port of Adulis. Interestingly, the commodities that were coming in were completely different than the ones that were going out. As you mentioned, ivory was an important export, but they were also exporting a lot of gold and live animals, aromatic substance outside from the Horn of Africa. And they were importing exotic or luxurious commodities, mostly geared towards the elite or the ruling class. They were importing linen, glass, brass, copper, iron axes, knives, copper cups, Italian wine, olive, all the way from the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Persian Empire, from India, through the Indian Ocean Trade Network. So we have a good documentation of things being imported and exported, and trade was really key to their success in that part of the world as well. Trade and agriculture were an important wealth for the establishment of the ancient Axumite Empire.
So that was trade, external imports and exports coming through the port of Adulis, but there was also an important internal trade route, you said, Helena.
Yes, so I really focus actually on the internal trade network of the Axumites and the pre-Axumites. The main commodity that was running the Axumite Empire or state was the salt trade that was coming from the lowlands found today in the Afar region, which is the hottest place on earth. There they have a rich source of good salt that they can exploit for internal trading to expand their territories within the Horn of Africa, as well as trading with the outside world. So salt was the white gold of the ancient Axumites. It was a very precious commodity. And they were agriculturalists, and they were surrounded by mobile pastoralists who really needed salt for their cattle. And the agriculturalists, they lacked salt in the highlands where the center of the Axumite Empire resided. So this kind of symbiotic relationship between the lowlanders who resided in the Salt territory and the Highland Axomites was an important trading relationship that dates back at least 1000 millennium.
You called it white gold. It's right, isn't it, that it was even used as a currency?
Yes. When we talk about currency in the Axumite Empire, salt is mentioned side by side with coins, minted coins. So internal trade really relied on bar salt called amole. Internal exchange, especially in the rural areas where bartering was very common, salt bars were important for this kind of trading relationships. And the Axumite traded with so many ethnic groups within the Horn of Africa, even with people they didn't speak the language, but salt was their language of exchange with these different ethnic groups, which is a melting pot of languages in the Horn of Africa.
Felga, we heard about all this trade, but you've mentioned, and Helena's also mentioned, that the economy was also heavily reliant on agriculture. So tell us more about that.
Yes, so much of what I'm saying is basically derived from the evidence in the inscriptions. There doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in trade or trade security in the inscriptions. There is, however, a great deal of interest in the securing of cattle and slaves after military campaigns. And so this seems to suggest that the sort of base of the Axumite Empire, the sort of economic base, material base of it, was rooted in this sort of agricultural lifestyle. With that said, we have a number of urban settlements, and they seem to have been fed by the countryside. In the countryside, they appear to be growing wheat, barley, sorghum.
Now, we need to think about all sorts of different pieces of evidence, and one that we haven't talked about very much so far are Axumite coins. So I want to ask all three of you now why this coinage is so important and what it tells us. Helena.
The coins are important in two ways. The first one is the Axumites minting these coins made of gold, silver, and bronze were used or were created as the same standard as the international trading empires that were competing with the Axumites at the time, like the Romans, the Chinese empires. So the coins of the Axumites being accepted by these powerful nations outside Africa shows that the Axumites were considered as an equal competitor in power as well as in wealth. The second aspect we see is that the coins being minted by the Axumites were also used internally, which means there is a well-established economic or market system within Africa that needed this kind of precious metal exchange system. So we see a very complex trading network happening in the Horn of Africa. Like I said, they were using salt for local trade and bartering, but they were also minting coins, which means they were buying land. There is a taxation system that was well established that shows that the market was really geared towards profit making as well. Those are the 2 points that I see when I look at the coin minting system during the Axumite period. And if I can add a third one, the most important information we get from the coins in terms of looking at the chronology of the Axumite period, and when we talk about religion, is that so much information is also put on those coins. We see the languages being used by the emperors at the time. They used at least 2 languages on the coins, on one side Greek, on the other side Ge'ez. Again, it shows that they were very outward as well as inward oriented. We also see their religious or ideology reflected on the coins. So again, we see them putting their pre-Christian symbols on the coins, and then after Christianity, their Christian symbology on the coins. The other aspect we see is economy. Since I'm looking at the economy, we also see them depicting wheat and barley on the coins, which was the core of their agricultural economy. So they were depicting so many things in those tiny coins, in addition to using them for trade and exchange.
Niall, what would you add?
Just around what Helena has said there, that yes, the evidence for a shift in religious behaviour is clear there, with the relegation of the crescent moon on the surfaces of the coins to a cross, and a subtle change in the use of the text as well, to emphasise Son of God as well. So we can see an element of Christianity that's visible there in the coinage. We have the international dimension too of Axamite gold coins being found around the Red Sea and in South Arabia using Greek. And in fact, these Axamite gold coins, at the point of their lowest purity, they were 90% pure. So they were very, very pure gold coins that, in a sense, they were freely exchangeable. You have to bear in mind that the Romans were undertaking currency reforms with Diocletian, for example, in 301, when the value of the aureus was taken down, and the Axamite coinage, to use a modern economic term, was essentially pegged to this. So that's very, very important to see the international dimension there, as well as reflecting changes in religious behaviour too. The coinage didn't just emerge from a vacuum. The periplus of the Erythraean Sea tells us that the Axamites were importing elements of silver to use in a kind of quasi-coinage system. And from the monastery at Debradamo, there was a hoard of Kushan coins, Indian coins dating from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, that show that the knowledge of coinage was there in Axum before they started to mint theirs under the reign of Endibis in 270.
Felga, Niall and Helena have indicated how this coinage shows how outward-looking this empire was, but there is an argument, isn't there, that the coins may have been used for local trade?
To me, what these coins really show, beyond, I guess, the very good points made about transition of religion, its use in archaeological dating, what it really shows to me, in particular the use of Greek on the gold coinage, is this sort of self-confidence of the Axamite Empire, is using the coins as a tool of propaganda to stand on the world stage and really present itself as a world power on par with Rome, Persia, and the empires of India and China.
Well, the Axamites were the first people ever to use the Christian symbol of the image of the cross on their coins. And stay with us, because in the second half of this programme, we're going to hear more about how the empire became one of the earliest adopters of the relatively new religion of Christianity in the 3rd century AD. We'll be back in a moment.
This is the BBC World Service, and this year may have been different, but some things stay almost the same.
As dusk falls, the choir gathers in the candlelit chapel to sing carols.
Daniel Hyde conducts the choir of King's College, Cambridge.
Unfortunately, we won't be joined by a congregation. However, we are looking forward to sharing many wonderful arrangements of the congregational hymns. There'll be other favourites too, such as In the Bleak Midwinter.
A festival of 9 lessons and carols on the BBC World Service. Thursday at 15 GMT.
Still to come on the forum, more on the story of the rise and fall of the kingdom of Axum, why it came to embrace the new religion of Christianity so early on, even before the Roman Empire had adopted it, the ancient alphabetic script it developed, which is still in use in liturgy today, and why the Axamite Empire, once so powerful, fell into decline. My 3 guests are still with me, so stay with us. We'll be back with more after the news summary.
BBC News. Italy and the Netherlands have suspended flights from Britain over fears about a highly transmissible variant of coronavirus. Belgium is closing its borders to British travellers for an initial 24-hour period from midnight, and Germany has said it is evaluating flight restrictions. In London, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has suggested the capital could remain in lockdown for some months to contain the spread of the new variant. He acknowledged it was out of control. In the United States, batches of the Moderna vaccine have been leaving warehouses, heading for nearly 4,000 healthcare facilities across the country. Police in Nigeria say they have rescued at least 84 children abducted by gunmen in the northwestern state of Katsina on Saturday. It is a second mass release in 3 days. The party of the Central African Republic's former president, Francois Bozize, has denied he is trying to stage a coup a week before a general election. The government had accused Mr. Bozize of marching on the capital with a rebel alliance. Turkish-backed fighters in northeastern Syria have announced a new offensive in a region controlled by the mainly Kurdish militia that led the fighting against the Islamic State group. The Free Syrian Army said it would move on the town of Ain Issa in the coming hours. Police in Austria have arrested 2 more people suspected of involvement in a deadly Islamist terrorist attack in Vienna last month, in which 4 civilians were killed. The gunman, a dual Austrian North Macedonian national, was shot dead by police. The security forces in Belarus have been detaining more people as protests continue against President Alexander Lukashenko. There have been weekly demonstrations since a discredited election in August. And coronavirus restrictions in Ireland have prevented crowds from travelling to the Neolithic Passage tomb at Newgrange to witness the moment that sunlight floods its chamber. The winter solstice phenomenon was streamed online instead. BBC News.
Welcome back to the Forum from the BBC World Service. I'm Bridget Kendall, and today we're talking about the Axamite Empire, an ancient kingdom centred in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Still with me are Helena Solomon Waldekiris, Felix Selam Solomon Yirga, and Niall Finneran. And if you'd like to listen to other programmes about ancient civilisations, you can find past editions of the Forum on our website. There you'll find shows about the fabled city of Timbuktu, the beguiling Egyptian queen Nefertiti, and the secrets of the Great Pyramid at Giza. You can also download any episode as a podcast by searching for BBC The Forum. Earlier in the programme, we heard about Axamite trading routes and the links across the ancient world. And one of the most significant imports into the kingdom of Axum was a new religion. Helena, tell us more about the religious beliefs of the Axamites before the arrival of Christianity.
They had several deities. Maharim was actually the war god of the Axumites, and he was also the royal and dynastic patron. And we also have South Arabian or Sabian gods like Al-Muka. So these are the most important pre-Christian deities that we know so far.
How did the kingdom come to embrace Christianity?
The coming of Christianity is very interesting. We are still trying to find out this pattern, but we have good documents written during the Axumite period that talk about the conversion of the elite or the ruling class during the Axumite period. And also this tradition and story is also embraced within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Locally, when we talk about Ethiopian history, it always starts with the conversion of Ezana by Syrian immigrants to the Axumite Empire. We have their names written by Rufinus, who was a Latin writer. The story goes that Odysseus and Fermintius came to the coast of Adolis with a Syrian philosopher or explorer called Meropius. Apparently they were on their way to India and their boat completely capsized. So they were captured by the Axumites. Meropius died, but Odysseus and Fermintius were really young children at the time. So the king of Axum took them in his household and kept them there and raised them. And from the story, we know he really loved these 2 young Syrians. When the king died, his son Ezana was really young. So Ezana's mother, the queen, begged the Syrian relatives not to leave her. So we know Fermintius was a very religious individual, and we have from the writing that he was encouraging merchants residing in the Axumite Empire, encouraging them to practice their Christian religion. He also used his power as part of the royal court administration to give them land and resources to build churches. So we have this story, but we always go back to Ezana being the first convert.
This is King Ezana.
Correct. So this is King Ezana, who will take over power once he grows up and takes over his mother's administration of the empire.
So do we think that it really was a sudden conversion by a king, or could it have been a more gradual thing? I mean, Axum was a big trading port with lots of influences, ideas coming in, presumably, as well as goods.
Correct. So since I look at the trading pattern of the Axomites, my hypothesis is that Christianity came as a package through the trade route because of the extensive connection that the Axomites had with the outside world. And we know they were importing new religions before Christianity, like I mentioned, South Arabian religions. We even have early Jewish community in Ethiopia who came to Ethiopia around the 6th century BC. So conversion to Christianity was a gradual process which came with the other ideas that came to the Horn of Africa.
Helena, you were part of a team of archaeologists who recently uncovered the oldest known Christian church in Sub-Saharan Africa in this region. Can you tell us more about this find and why it's important?
Yes. So the site of Beit Sama'ati was excavated and discovered by my colleague Michael Harwer at Johns Hopkins. This site is near Yeha, which was the pre-Axomite political capital of that region. People thought Yeha was abandoned when the capital moved to Axum city. But the discovery of the site near Yeha, about 6 kilometers away, shows an administrative center that continued to exist from pre-Axomite to Axomite period. At this site, so many important discoveries were made, and one of them was finding this basilica, which is the earliest church, like you said, for Sub-Saharan Africa. The meaning of this finding is that since the early converts were coming from the Roman world and introducing Christianity, and the building architecture is designed the same way as the early Roman basilica, which is more a rectangular structure. And here we find not only the building, but the other team members discovered an inscription right by the basilica, which says, "Christ protect us," or "Be our guide." So it was written in Old Ge'ez script and mentioning Christ in the inscription found in the building.
It must have been incredibly exciting to find.
Yes, all of us were really excited about this discovery. It wasn't only where we found the earliest church, but it was located right at the crossroad of the trade route that was going to the port of Adolis and going straight to Axum. So it's an amazing site. So you have evidence for international and local trade. You have evidence for early Christianity at this particular site.
Just give us the dates of how old it seems the church is.
So the church dates to the 4th century AD, which actually correlates with the story of the conversion of Ezana. So here we have for the first time the actual historical documents agreeing with the archaeological findings. So this is another exciting finding of the site.
Niall, why do you think Christianity took such a hold among the Axamites, given that at this point the Roman Empire hadn't even adopted Christianity formally?
Well, a number of early Christian communities in northeastern Africa. To bear in mind, there was an extensive Coptic Egyptian Christian community that started in Alexandria from the 1st century AD, and subsequently the Coptic Church would have very strong ties with the Ethiopian Church. So we've got that sort of general African network going on there. What I think is interesting from the point of view of Beit Sama'ati is, as Helena points out, is it's a very, very interesting site. It's huge potential to show a very, very long-lived sequence here. In comparison with what's happening at the capital city of Axum, we don't actually have that much archaeological evidence. Perhaps the sort of strongest element is the shift in burial tradition there in Axum, because it's fairly clear then that the tradition of erecting stele as grave markers that was commonplace within the pre-Christian phases of Axum ceases. And the burial traditions subtly change. We have a kind of transitional burial, and then we move on to much more recognisable